Why Thailand was never colonized. Episode 1, The Stranger Who Arrived in Siam. A sleep story for curious minds. Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you and the last sounds of the day slowly fade into the distance, I invite you on a journey. Not to a kingdom of dragons, not to a land of magic, but to a real place. A place that, in many ways, achieved something just as remarkable. A land known today as Thailand. A country that sits in the heart of Southeast Asia. A country surrounded by nations that were once controlled by powerful European empires. And yet somehow, Thailand remained free. As you settle into a comfortable position, imagine yourself drifting back through time, far away from highways and skyscrapers, far away from airplanes and smartphones, back to a century when much of the world was divided among empires. Back to an age when powerful nations stretched their influence across oceans and continents. Back to the 19th century, and our story begins with a traveler, a young man from Europe. A man who had spent years crossing oceans and rivers, collecting stories from distant lands. His name was Edward Whitmore. He was not famous. He was not wealthy. He was simply curious. And curiosity, as you may know, can sometimes carry a person farther than money ever could. One warm evening in the year 1888, Edward stood aboard a steamship as it slowly approached the city known to foreigners as Bangkok. The sky above was painted in shades of gold and orange. The great river shimmered beneath the fading sunlight. Wooden boats drifted silently across the water. Temple roofs sparkled in the distance. The air smelled faintly of river mud, cooking rice, and tropical flowers. Edward leaned against the railing. His notebook rested in one hand. His hat sat slightly crooked from weeks of travel. He watched the shoreline grow closer, and he thought he already knew what he would find. After all, he had visited British Burma. He had seen French-controlled territories. He had walked through colonial ports where foreign flags flew proudly above government buildings. He assumed Siam would be much the same. Perhaps a few local traditions remained, perhaps a few old customs survived. But surely, he thought, European influence must rule here too. How could it not? Nearly every nation in the region had fallen under colonial control. It seemed almost inevitable. History, he believed, moved in one direction. Powerful nations expanded. Smaller nations surrendered. That was simply how the world worked. Or so he thought. The steamship's horn echoed across the water. Dock workers prepared ropes. Passengers gathered their belongings. And as the vessel finally came to rest against the pier, Edward stepped onto Siamese soil for the very first time. The evening air wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Not unpleasant, just different. Everything felt alive. The sounds, the smells, the colors, the movement. Nearby, merchants arranged baskets of fruit. Children laughed as they ran between market stalls. Monks in saffron robes walked quietly along the riverside. Boats glided through canals like silent shadows. Edward opened his notebook. He began writing observations immediately, but the more he looked around, the more confused he became. Something felt different. There were no foreign soldiers patrolling the streets, no European governor's residence dominating the skyline, no colonial flags fluttering overhead. Instead, everywhere he looked, he saw symbols of Siam itself: temples, royal emblems, local officials, local merchants, local culture. The city felt unmistakably Siamese, and that puzzled him. As darkness slowly settled over Bangkok, Edward found lodging in a small riverside guest house. The owner welcomed him warmly. A lantern hung near the entrance. The wooden building overlooked the river, and from the balcony, Edward watched countless lights flicker across the water. The scene felt peaceful, timeless, yet one question refused to leave his mind. How? How had this happened? How had this country remained independent? The next morning, before the heat of the day arrived, Edward began exploring. He wandered through busy markets. He crossed narrow bridges. He watched craftsmen carve wood beneath shaded awnings. Everywhere he went, he asked questions. And everywhere he went, people smiled politely. Some answered. Some laughed. Some pointed him toward others who might know more. Eventually, an elderly shopkeeper paused for a moment. Then he said something interesting. "If you want to understand Siam," the old man pointed toward the river, "you should speak with Kun Prasert." Edward frowned. "Who is Kun Prasert?" The shopkeeper smiled. "A storyteller." Now, Edward had met many storytellers during his travels. Most exaggerated events, many mixed facts with legends, but they often revealed truths hidden beneath official records. So he followed the direction. The path led him toward a quieter section of the river, away from busy markets, away from crowded streets. Eventually, he arrived at a small wooden pavilion overlooking the water. An old man sat there alone. His hair was silver. His posture remained straight despite his age. Beside him rested a clay teapot. The river flowed calmly beyond. The old man appeared entirely at peace. Edward approached respectfully. "Are you Kun Prasert?" The old man looked up. A gentle smile crossed his face. "I am." Edward introduced himself. The old man listened patiently. Then he poured tea into a small cup. "Please sit." Edward did. For a moment, neither spoke. The river moved slowly past them. Birds called from distant trees. The morning breeze carried the scent of jasmine. Finally, Edward asked the question that had brought him there. Why was Siam never colonized? Kun Prasert smiled. Not because the question was foolish, but because he had heard it many times before. He lifted his cup, studied the ripples on the river, and then he said something Edward never forgot. Most people ask the wrong question. Edward blinked. "What do you mean?" The old storyteller pointed toward the flowing water. "The real question is not why Siam survived." He paused. "The real question is how close we came to losing everything." The breeze stirred gently around them. Edward suddenly felt very small, very far from home, and very aware that history might be more complicated than he had imagined. The old man continued. "You see this river?" Edward nodded. "It looks peaceful." "It is." Kun Prasert smiled. "But beneath the surface, powerful currents move in different directions." He pointed upstream. "That is how the world looked during the Age of Empires." Then he pointed downstream. Great powers moved across continents. His finger shifted westward, the British Empire, then eastward, the French Empire. Edward listened carefully. Already he sensed that this conversation would become something special, perhaps even life-changing. Kun Prasert leaned back. The British controlled Burma. The French controlled much of Indochina. Both wanted influence. Both wanted territory. And between them stood Siam. He allowed silence to settle for a moment. The river continued flowing. A boat drifted past. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rang softly. Then the old man spoke again. "Imagine two enormous elephants." Edward smiled. That seemed an appropriate image for Siam. "Two giant elephants," the storyteller continued, "each moving toward the same piece of land. What happens?" Edward considered. "They fight." "Exactly." Kun Prasert nodded. "And what happens to the grass beneath them?" Edward looked toward the river. For the first time, he understood the metaphor. "The grass suffers." The old storyteller smiled. "Very good." Then his expression became thoughtful. "Siam was the grass." Edward waited. "But we were also something else." "What?" Kun Prasert's eyes sparkled. "We learned how to move." The young traveler felt a chill despite the warm weather. The answer sounded simple, yet somehow profound. Move, adapt, change, survive. Perhaps that was the secret. But he sensed there was much more to learn. And indeed there was, because over the coming days, Kun Prasert would tell him stories of kings who studied foreign languages, stories of diplomats who negotiated impossible agreements, stories of painful sacrifices, stories of difficult choices, stories of courage, and stories of wisdom. Not fairy tales, not myths, but real events that shaped the destiny of a nation. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the storyteller poured another cup of tea. Edward opened his notebook. Fresh pages waited, blank, ready. The old man smiled. To understand why Siam remained free, he looked toward the river. You must first understand the world that surrounded her. The water shimmered beneath the sunlight. Boats drifted lazily past. Life continued as it always had. Yet Edward felt as though a hidden door had just opened. A doorway into history. A doorway into one of the most remarkable survival stories in the modern world. And so, beneath the warm Siamese sky, beside the gentle flow of the Chao Phraya River, the lesson began. A lesson about power, about diplomacy, about sacrifice, and about a small kingdom that stood between empires. A kingdom that somehow endured when so many others disappeared. But that story, the deeper story, would have to wait until tomorrow night. For now, allow your thoughts to drift like boats upon a quiet river. Imagine lanterns reflecting upon calm water. Imagine temple bells echoing softly through the evening air. Imagine the warm breeze of old Siam. And as sleep slowly approaches, remember the question that brought Edward across oceans and continents. How did a small kingdom survive in an age of empires? That answer is waiting. And our journey has only just begun. Episode 2. A small kingdom between hungry empires. The following morning arrived gently over Bangkok. Before the sun had fully risen, the city was already awake. Wooden boats glided across the Chao Phraya River. Merchants prepared their stalls. The scent of charcoal fires and freshly cooked rice drifted through the humid air. And somewhere in the distance, temple bells welcomed a new day. Edward Whitmore stood on the balcony of his guest house, watching the river below. The conversation with Khun Praser lingered in his thoughts. The real question is how close we came to losing everything. Those words had followed him into sleep. And now, as dawn painted the sky with shades of pink and gold, he found himself eager to hear more. After a simple breakfast, he made his way back toward the riverside pavilion. The city seemed different today. Not because Bangkok had changed, but because his eyes had changed. Yesterday, he had seen temples. Today, he wondered who had protected them. Yesterday, he had seen markets. Today, he wondered how they had survived. Yesterday, he had seen an independent kingdom. Today, he wanted to understand how fragile that independence had once been. When he arrived, Khun Prasert was already there. The old storyteller sat exactly where he had been the day before. A teapot rested beside him. The river moved quietly beyond. And once again, he appeared perfectly at peace. Edward bowed respectfully. "Good morning. Good morning, my friend." The old man poured tea into 2 cups. For a moment, neither spoke. The river carried floating reflections of the morning sky. A fisherman guided his boat along the shore. Birds circled overhead. Finally, Edward opened his notebook. "I've been thinking about what you said." Khun Prasert smiled. "That is always a good sign. You said Siam almost lost everything." "Yes." Edward hesitated. Was it really that dangerous? The storyteller looked toward the horizon. For a few moments, he remained silent. Then he nodded. "Far more dangerous than most people realize." The old man's expression grew thoughtful. To understand what happened, you must imagine the world as it existed nearly 200 years ago. Edward leaned forward. Khun Prasert pointed toward the river. "Imagine you are standing in a small garden." The young traveler nodded. "Now imagine 2 enormous men approaching from opposite directions. All right, they are strong, they are wealthy, they are ambitious, and they both want the same land." The storyteller paused. What happens to the small garden between them? Edward already knew the answer. It gets destroyed. Usually. The old man smiled sadly. Usually. He reached for his tea. The 19th century was the age of empires. His voice remained calm, steady, the kind of voice that seemed perfectly suited for storytelling. Across the world, powerful nations expanded their influence. Britain, France, Russia, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal. Many believed it was their destiny to control distant lands. Edward nodded. This much he knew. He had seen evidence everywhere during his travels. European flags flew over ports thousands of miles from Europe. Foreign governors ruled territories they had never been born in. Entire cultures found themselves under outside control. The storyteller continued. By the early 1800s, Southeast Asia had become extremely valuable. Why? Trade. The answer came immediately. Ships traveled between India and China. Spices, rice, rubber, timber, minerals. Wealth flowed through these waters. Kunprasert gestured toward the river. Control the region, and you controlled enormous opportunities. Edward wrote quickly. The old man watched him for a moment before continuing. One empire approached from the west, the British. His finger pointed toward the horizon. They already controlled India. Then he traced an imaginary line eastward, and they wanted security for their trade routes. Edward nodded. The British Empire was powerful beyond imagination. Its influence stretched across continent. At its height, people often said the sun never set upon it. Kunprasert continued. Gradually, Britain expanded deeper into Southeast Asia. First trade, then influence, then territory. He paused, and eventually Burma. Edward knew Burma, present-day Myanmar, a large kingdom west of Siam. What happened? The storyteller sighed softly. There were wars, several of them. Over time, the British defeated the Burmese kingdom. By 1885, Burma became part of the British Empire. Edward frowned. That placed British territory directly beside Siam's western border. A powerful empire now stood at one side of the kingdom. But Kunprasert had mentioned two empires, not one. The old man pointed east. Meanwhile, another power approached, France. The name carried weight, even thousands of miles from Europe. The French arrived through diplomacy, trade, missionaries, exploration. Then his expression grew more serious, and eventually military power. He traced another invisible path across the air. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, one by one. Like pieces on a map, these regions gradually came under French control. Edward stared at his notebook, then back at the storyteller. Siam was in the middle. Exactly. The old man nodded. Britain controlled Burma. France controlled territories to the east. He spread his hands, and between them sat Siam. For a few moments, neither spoke. The significance settled heavily between them. Siam had not been isolated. It had not been overlooked. It had not escaped attention. Quite the opposite. It occupied one of the most strategically important positions in the region. The kingdom stood directly between two expanding empires. The pressure must have been enormous. As though reading Edward's thoughts, Kunprasert nodded. Imagine being a small boat. He pointed toward a vessel drifting along the river. Now imagine two great ships approaching from opposite directions. Edward watched the boat. It seemed tiny compared to the wide river. Vulnerable, fragile. What would you do? The storyteller asked. Edward considered. Stay out of their way. Kunprasert smiled. Exactly. Then he added quietly, but sometimes there is nowhere to move. A breeze stirred the leaves overhead. The morning sun reflected off the water. Everything around them felt peaceful. Yet, the story itself felt increasingly tense. The old man continued. Many countries faced impossible choices. Resist and risk war. Cooperate and risk losing independence. Negotiate and hope for the best. None of the options sounded attractive. Edward thought about the countless nations that had already fallen under colonial rule. Entire kingdoms had vanished. Governments had been replaced. Borders had been redrawn. The process often seemed unstoppable. So why didn't Britain simply take Siam? He finally asked. And why didn't France? Kunprasert smiled. Now we are approaching the heart of the story. He poured more tea. The steam curled gently into the air. You see, empires were powerful, but they were also practical. Edward listened carefully. Neither Britain nor France wanted the other to become too strong. That made sense. Empires competed with one another. Even allies often distrusted each other. The storyteller continued. If Britain controlled Siam, France would worry. If France controlled Siam, Britain would worry. Edward slowly began to understand. Siam occupied a unique position. It served as a space between rival powers, a buffer, a neutral zone, a kingdom whose existence helped prevent direct conflict between larger empires. Kunprasert nodded approvingly. You are beginning to see it. Edward smiled. For the first time, the puzzle felt slightly less mysterious. But only slightly, because geography alone could not explain everything. Other buffer states had disappeared throughout history. Being strategically useful did not guarantee survival. The storyteller seemed to anticipate his next question. And yet, he said softly, being a buffer was not enough. Edward immediately nodded. That's exactly what I was thinking. Kuhn Prasert laughed. A curious mind. Then his expression grew thoughtful once more. The truth is that geography provided an opportunity, but leadership determined what happened next. The old man pointed toward Bangkok, toward the city beyond. While many rulers resisted change, Siam's kings studied the world. Edward looked up. Now the conversation was moving toward people, toward decisions, toward the individuals who shaped history. And perhaps that was where the real answer lay. Not simply in maps, not simply in politics, but in human choices. The storyteller continued. Our kings understood something important. What? The world was changing. The answer sounded simple, yet Edward sensed its importance. Many nations failed because leaders clung to old assumptions. They believed the future would resemble the past, and when change arrived, they were unprepared. Kuhn Prasert nodded slowly. Siam could not stop the storm. His eyes drifted toward the river, but perhaps it could learn how to sail through it. The words lingered in the air, a poetic thought, and perhaps a truthful one. Around them, the morning continued. Boats crossed the river. Market sellers called to customers. Children laughed somewhere nearby. Life moved peacefully forward. Yet, hidden beneath that peaceful surface was the memory of a dangerous era. An era when powerful nations carved up continents. An era when maps changed rapidly. An era when Siam stood alone between giants. The storyteller finished his tea. Then he looked directly at Edward. Tomorrow I will tell you about a king. Edward waited. A king who studied astronomy. A king who spoke foreign languages. A king who understood that knowledge could become a weapon. The young traveler felt excitement rising. History was no longer a collection of dates. It was becoming a story, a living story, filled with difficult choices and remarkable people. Kuhn Prasert smiled, because before Siam could survive the age of empires, it needed a leader who understood the empire builders themselves. The old storyteller rose slowly. The conversation was over for the day. Edward closed his notebook, but his mind remained wide open. As he walked back through the streets of Bangkok, he looked around with new appreciation. The temples, the markets, the river. Everything he saw existed because countless people before him had navigated extraordinary dangers. And tomorrow, he would learn about one of the most important among them, a king whose curiosity may have helped save an entire nation. For now, however, the river continued its slow journey toward the sea. The afternoon sun warmed the city, and somewhere beyond the horizon, history waited patiently for the next chapter. So, as evening approaches, allow your thoughts to drift once more. Imagine the calm waters of the Chao Phraya. Imagine distant temple bells carried by the breeze. Imagine a small kingdom standing between great empires. And imagine a ruler gazing up at the stars, searching for answers in a changing world. Because tomorrow night, we will meet him, and the true story of Siam's survival will begin. Episode 3, The King Who Learned from the West. The evening rain had arrived gently over Bangkok. Not the violent kind of storm that frightened sailors. Not the kind that tore branches from trees. This rain was soft, steady, patient. It drummed quietly upon rooftops and flowed through narrow canals. The Chao Phraya River carried tiny ripples across its surface as lanterns reflected in the dark water. Edward Whitmore sat beneath the wooden pavilion once again. The familiar scent of tea drifted through the cool evening air. Across from him sat Kuhn Prasert. The old storyteller seemed perfectly at home in the rain, as though he had spent his entire life listening to storms. For a while, neither man spoke. They simply watched the river, listened to the rain, and allowed the world to slow down. Finally, Edward opened his notebook. Yesterday you mentioned a king. Kuhn Prasert smiled. I did. The king who understood the empire builders. The old storyteller nodded. Tonight we speak of one of the most extraordinary rulers in Siamese history. The rain continued falling softly around them, and then the story began. Long before Edward arrived in Siam, long before steamships filled the river, long before European powers surrounded the kingdom, a young prince walked quietly through the halls of the royal palace. His name was Mongkut, and no one knew that one day he would help change the future of an entire nation. The palace of Siam was very different then. Golden roofs shimmered beneath tropical sunlight. Courtyards echoed with footsteps. Monks moved silently through temple grounds. The kingdom still followed traditions that stretched back centuries. Yet, even as a young prince, Mongkut possessed something unusual. Curiosity. Not ordinary curiosity. Not the kind that asks a question and quickly forgets the answer. His was the deeper kind. The kind that never stops searching. The kind that keeps a person awake long after everyone else has gone to sleep. The kind that changes history. Khun Prasert paused to refill their teacups. The rain whispered against the pavilion roof. Edward leaned forward, already captivated. The old man continued. When Mongkut was young, no one expected him to become king. Edward looked surprised. Really? Really? The storyteller nodded. There were others ahead of him. The future seemed destined for someone else. But history often enjoys surprises. When political circumstances changed, Mongkut made a remarkable decision, one that would shape everything that followed. He entered the monkhood, not for a few weeks, not for a few months, but for many years, 27 years. Edward nearly dropped his pen. 27? Khun Prasert smiled. Yes, for almost 3 decades, the prince lived as a Buddhist monk. And during those years, something extraordinary happened. While many rulers of the era focused only on politics and warfare, Mongkut studied relentlessly. He studied religion, philosophy, history, languages, astronomy, mathematics, geography, anything he could learn. He wanted to understand the world, not merely his own kingdom, the entire world. Outside the pavilion, lightning flickered silently beyond distant clouds, not close enough to be dangerous, just enough to illuminate the horizon for a brief moment. The storyteller watched the river, then continued. At that time, foreign visitors were arriving in greater numbers. Missionaries, merchants, diplomats. They brought books. They brought maps. They brought ideas. Many rulers viewed foreigners with suspicion. Some ignored them entirely. Others rejected anything foreign. But Mongkut chose a different path. He listened. He learned. He asked questions. He practiced foreign languages. He spoke with travelers from distant lands. He read scientific texts. He examined maps of places he had never seen. Little by little, he began to understand something that many leaders missed. The world was changing, and it was changing quickly. Edward imagined the young monk sitting beneath candlelight, reading books from distant countries, studying stars above the temple roofs, trying to understand forces that were reshaping continents. The image felt peaceful, yet strangely powerful, because knowledge itself was becoming a tool of survival. Khun Prasert seemed to sense the same thought. You see, he said quietly, many kingdoms feared Western technology. Edward nodded. That was true in many parts of the world, but Mongkut wanted to understand it. The storyteller smiled. He knew that you cannot negotiate effectively with people you do not understand. The rain softened further, almost disappearing. The city beyond seemed wrapped in mist, a world suspended between past and present. Years passed. The monk grew older. The world continued changing. British influence expanded. French influence expanded. European ships traveled farther than ever before. And eventually, fate called Mongkut back from monastic life. In 1851, he became king, King Mongkut, known today as Rama IV. And when he ascended the throne, he brought something unusual with him. Not an army, not vast wealth, not military power. He brought knowledge, years of accumulated knowledge, knowledge that would soon become invaluable. The storyteller's voice grew softer, almost as though he were sharing a secret. When foreign diplomats arrived, they discovered something unexpected. Edward listened carefully. They expected to meet a traditional ruler. The old man smiled. Instead, they met someone who understood them. King Mongkut could discuss science, geography, politics, religion, astronomy, international affairs. He understood how European nations thought, what motivated them, what they feared, what they wanted. This made him difficult to deceive and difficult to underestimate. Edward paused in his writing. That idea felt important. Throughout history, many nations have been conquered because their leaders misunderstood the intentions of outsiders. But Mongkut seemed determined to avoid that mistake. Kun Prasert nodded. As a monk, he had spent decades preparing without realizing exactly what he was preparing for. The river flowed quietly past them. The rain finally stopped. Clouds parted. A few stars appeared overhead. And somehow that felt appropriate, because astronomy played an important role in the king's story. One evening many years ago, King Mongkut studied celestial calculation. He examined charts, measurements, astronomical predictions, and after careful study, he made a bold announcement. A solar eclipse would occur, not merely somewhere in the world, but at a specific place in Siam at a specific time. The prediction was remarkably precise. Foreign scientists paid attention. Some doubted him, others were intrigued. When the day finally arrived, observers gathered. The sky darkened. The moon moved across the sun, and the king's calculations proved astonishingly accurate. The prediction was correct, almost perfectly correct. For many Europeans, this was surprising. They had assumed Asian rulers relied solely upon tradition. Instead, they witnessed a monarch capable of sophisticated scientific calculation, a king who understood modern astronomy, a king who valued evidence and observation, a king who belonged fully to the modern world. Edward smiled. The story felt almost symbolic. The king studying the heavens while preparing his nation for uncertain times. The storyteller continued. Respect matters. The young traveler nodded. It does. When powerful nations respect you, negotiations become different. That made sense. European leaders might still pursue their interests, but they would approach Siam differently if they viewed its ruler as educated, capable, and informed. King Mongkut understood this. He knew that image mattered. Perception mattered. Knowledge mattered. The old storyteller picked up a small leaf that had drifted into the pavilion. He held it thoughtfully. Imagine two men meet. One appears ignorant. The other appears wise. Who has the advantage? The wise one. Usually. Kun Prasert nodded. King Mongkut wanted the world to see Siam clearly, not as a backward kingdom, not as an easy target, but as a nation capable of learning, capable of adapting, capable of engaging with modern ideas. And that perception became one layer of protection. Not enough by itself, but important, very important. The night deepened around them. Lantern light reflected gently across the river. Somewhere nearby, music drifted faintly through the darkness. The city seemed peaceful. Yet, beneath the calm atmosphere, Edward increasingly sensed the tension of history. Because knowledge alone would not save Siam. Challenges still lay ahead. Great challenges, the kind that would test every lesson King Mongkut had learned. The storyteller's voice became quieter, more reflective. Mongkut understood something that many leaders refused to accept. Edward waited. The old world was disappearing. The words lingered between them. The kingdoms that survived would be those willing to change, not abandon themselves, not surrender their identity, but adapt, learn, grow, modernize. That required courage, because change is rarely comfortable. Even today, perhaps especially today, the old man looked up toward the stars. More had appeared now, tiny lights scattered across the night sky. The same stars King Mongkut had studied many years earlier. The same stars sailors used to cross oceans. The same stars that watched silently over empires rising and falling. King Mongkut laid the foundation. The storyteller said. He prepared Siam for what was coming. Edward closed his notebook. He sensed the chapter drawing to a close, but he would not finish the work alone. Kun Prasert smiled. No, the old man gazed toward the distant city lights. A younger king would continue the journey. A king who traveled. A king who modernized the nation. A king who faced some of the greatest dangers in Siamese history. Edward already knew who he meant. King Chulalongkorn, Rama V, one of the most respected figures in Thai history, and apparently one of the central figures in this remarkable survival story. The storyteller rose slowly. The evening lesson had ended, but the story was growing larger, deeper, more complex. What had once seemed like a simple question, why was Thailand never colonized, was revealing itself to be a tapestry woven from countless decisions, curiosity, learning, diplomacy, adaptation, vision, and leadership. The rain clouds drifted away. The stars shone brighter. The river continued its timeless journey toward the sea, and as you prepare to rest tonight, imagine that young monk studying beneath candlelight. Imagine pages of books spread across wooden floors. Imagine maps from distant lands. Imagine a future king gazing at the stars and quietly preparing for challenges not yet visible. Because sometimes the greatest battles are won long before they begin. And sometimes the survival of a nation begins with a single person willing to learn. Sleep peacefully now. The river still flows. The lanterns still glow. And tomorrow night, we will meet the king who carried Siam into the modern age. The king who would face the empire builders themselves. Episode 4, The Young King and the Modern Nation. The night air over Bangkok was unusually calm. The river flowed beneath a silver moon. Lanterns floated gently upon the dark water. Some drifted slowly with the current. Others remained tethered near wooden piers, casting trembling reflections across the surface. The city had begun to quiet. Merchants packed away their goods. Boatmen secured their vessels. Families gathered for evening meals. And somewhere beyond the rooftops, temple bells echoed softly through the warm tropical darkness. Edward Whitmore made his way once again toward the riverside pavilion. By now, the walk felt familiar. The winding paths, the scent of jasmine carried by the breeze, the distant sounds of the city. Each evening seemed to draw him deeper into the story of Siam. And each evening, the answer to his original question became more complex. The kingdom had not survived because of luck, nor because the great empires had ignored it. It had survived because generation after generation of leaders had recognized danger long before it arrived. Tonight, he hoped to learn about the next chapter, the chapter many historians considered one of the most important, the chapter of a young king who would inherit a nation standing between rival empires, a king who would face decisions so difficult that they would shape the future of millions. When Edward arrived, Kun Prasert was already waiting. The old storyteller smiled warmly. "Good evening, my friend." "Good evening." Tea was poured, the river flowed, and after a moment of comfortable silence, the story continued. When King Mongkut passed away in 1868, the old man began, Siam entered a new chapter. Edward nodded. He remembered the previous evening story. The monk who became king. The ruler who studied science, the man who understood that knowledge could become a shield. But every generation faces its own challenges. Kun Prasert looked toward the river, and the challenges awaiting Siam were becoming greater. The old storyteller paused. Then he spoke a name that remains deeply respected throughout Thailand even today. Chulalongkorn, the future king Rama V, one of the most important figures in the nation's history. When Chulalongkorn was young, the world around him was changing rapidly. Steamships crossed oceans faster than ever before. Telegraph wires carried messages across continents. Railways connected distant cities. Factories transformed economies. Empires expanded. Technology accelerated. The pace of change itself seemed to be increasing. And unlike many rulers of his era, Chulalongkorn understood that Siam could not remain isolated from these transformations. The kingdom needed to evolve. Not because its traditions lacked value, but because survival required adaptation. The lesson his father had recognized was becoming even more urgent. Edward listened carefully. The old storyteller's voice carried the steady rhythm of someone who had told stories for many years. "A nation," Kun Prasert said softly, "must sometimes change in order to remain itself." The sentence lingered in the air. Edward wrote it down immediately. It seemed to capture something profound. Many leaders throughout history had faced a painful choice. Resist change completely and risk becoming vulnerable. or embrace change so completely that they lose their identity. The challenge was finding balance, and that balance would become central to Siam's survival. King Chulalongkorn inherited a kingdom facing immense pressure. To the west stood British-controlled Burma. To the east, French influence continued expanding. The two great empires watched Southeast Asia carefully. Every political decision mattered. Every diplomatic negotiation carried risks. Every weakness could invite intervention. The young king understood this, and rather than waiting for a crisis, he began transforming the nation. Kun Prasert picked up his teacup. The lantern light reflected softly against the ceramic surface. Imagine you are the ruler of a small kingdom. Edward nodded. Two powerful neighbors stand on either side. Yes, they claim your government is old-fashioned. They claim your institutions are weak. They claim your country needs outside guidance. The storyteller smiled slightly. How do you respond? Edward thought for a moment. By proving them wrong. Exactly. The old man nodded. And that is precisely what Chulalongkorn attempted to do. One of the first priorities was government reform. For centuries, Siam had operated according to systems that worked well within an older world. But the 19th century demanded something different. The kingdom needed modern administration, clearer laws, more efficient institutions, stronger central authority, not because foreign powers demanded it, but because effective governance made foreign intervention harder to justify. Throughout the colonial era, many imperial powers used a familiar argument. They claimed local governments were incapable of managing their own affairs. Whether that claim was true or not often mattered less than whether outsiders believed it. Chulalongkorn understood this. A stronger state would be more difficult to challenge. The reforms were not easy. Change rarely is. Every adjustment affected real people. Officials had to learn new systems. Old habits needed reconsideration. Long-standing traditions sometimes required modification. Many resisted. Some worried. Others feared the pace of transformation. Yet the king continued, patiently, carefully, determined to prepare Siam for a changing world. The river moved quietly beside the pavilion. The city lights shimmered in the darkness. Edward found himself imagining Bangkok during those years. A city caught between centuries. Ancient temples standing beside signs of modernity. Traditional boats sharing waterways with steam-powered vessels. Old customs existing alongside new ideas. The image felt vivid, alive, and perhaps slightly uncertain, because nobody knew exactly what the future would bring. Kun Prasert continued. One of the king's most famous reforms involved slavery. Edward looked up immediately. This was a topic he knew carried enormous significance. Many societies throughout history had depended upon systems of forced labor. Ending those systems often proved difficult and controversial. The storyteller nodded. In Siam, forms of slavery and bonded labor had existed for generations. But Chulalongkorn recognized something important. A modern nation needed a freer population. People who could participate more fully in society. People who could contribute to economic growth. People who could move beyond inherited limitations. So reforms began, gradually, carefully, step by step. The process took years, but eventually slavery was abolished. And remarkably, much of this transformation occurred without the kind of massive civil conflict seen elsewhere in the world. It was not perfect. No historical process ever is. But it represented a profound change, a sign that Siam could reform itself, a sign that progress did not require foreign rule. Edward wrote rapidly. He could already see why historians admired Chulalongkorn. The king was not merely reacting to events. He was actively shaping them, preparing the nation before disaster arrived, building resilience before it became absolutely necessary. The storyteller smiled. You are beginning to understand. Edward laughed softly. I think so. Good. Kun Prasert nodded. Because the story becomes more difficult from here. The king also invested heavily in education. Schools expanded, new subjects were introduced. Knowledge spread more widely. The next generation would need skills suited to a rapidly changing world. Science, languages, administration, engineering. Modern governance required educated citizens. and educated citizens strengthened the nation. The reforms extended even further. Communication systems improved, transportation networks expanded, government ministries became more organized. The kingdom slowly transformed itself, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Like a river carving its path through stone, the moon climbed higher overhead. The air felt cooler now. A pleasant breeze drifted across the water. For a few moments, the storyteller remained silent, allowing the weight of the story to settle. Then he spoke again. Many people imagine that survival comes from dramatic moments. Edward nodded. Battles, victories, heroic speeches. History books often focused on such events, but sometimes survival comes from quieter things. The old man pointed toward the city. A school, a government office, a railway, a legal reform, a difficult conversation, a decision made years before a crisis. Edward looked across the river. The lights of Bangkok flickered in the darkness, and he realized something important. The survival of Siam was not simply a diplomatic story. It was also an institutional story, a story of preparation, of modernization, of building strength from within. Yet, despite all these achievements, danger remained, perhaps greater than ever, because while Siam was reforming itself, the empires continued expanding. British influence remained powerful, French ambitions continued growing, and soon, tensions would reach a dangerous new level. The storyteller's voice grew quieter, more serious. The reforms helped, but they did not remove the threat. Edward felt a small knot of anticipation. He already knew difficult chapters lay ahead. The title of the overall story itself suggested survival against overwhelming odds. And survival stories always contain moments when survival seems uncertain. Kun Prasert nodded slowly. There would be negotiations, diplomatic confrontations, territorial disputes, and painful sacrifices. The word sacrifices caught Edward's attention. What kind of sacrifices? The old storyteller looked toward the river. For several moments he did not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a trace of sadness, the kind made by leaders who must choose between losing a part of their country, or risking the loss of all of it. Silence followed, only the sound of water moving gently beneath the moonlight. Edward felt the weight of those words. History often celebrated victories, but sometimes wisdom required accepting painful compromises. Sometimes survival itself carried a price, and soon Siam would be forced to pay it. The storyteller stood slowly. The evening lesson had reached its conclusion, but the larger story was moving toward its most dramatic chapters. The age of preparation was ending. The age of testing was about to begin. As Edward closed his notebook, he realized how much his understanding had changed. When he first arrived in Siam, he had imagined a simple explanation, a fortunate coincidence, a lucky circumstance. Instead, he was discovering a complex story filled with foresight, reform, diplomacy, and sacrifice. The kingdom had not merely survived, it had worked tirelessly to make survival possible. The moonlight shimmered across the river. Lanterns drifted in the darkness, and somewhere beyond the horizon, powerful empires continued pursuing their ambitions. Tomorrow night, the pressure would intensify. Tomorrow night, the map itself would begin to change, and the cost of independence would become painfully clear. For now, allow your thoughts to drift like lanterns upon calm water. Imagine the young king walking through the halls of his palace. Imagine schools being built, railways stretching across the countryside, new ideas flowing into an ancient kingdom. And imagine a ruler preparing his nation for storms not yet visible. Because sometimes the most important victories happen before anyone realizes a battle has begun. Sleep peacefully. The river still flows. The lanterns still glow. And the story of Siam's survival continues. Thailand still holds countless stories waiting to be discovered. If you would like to continue this journey together, I hope to see you again in the next story from Thailand Through Eyes. And if there is somewhere in Thailand you wish to visit through story, leave your suggestion below. Perhaps our next journey will begin there.